Russia's long road back to power. The day a superpower fell. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the country you had always known no longer existed. On December 26, 1991, that became reality for millions of people. The Soviet Union, one of the world's two great superpowers, officially collapsed after nearly 70 years. Overnight, the red flag that had flown over the Kremlin came down, and a new nation called the Russian Federation stepped into an uncertain future. For many people around the world, this marked the end of the Cold War. They believed democracy, freedom, and prosperity were finally on their way to Russia. But inside the country, the story was far more complicated. Instead of celebration, millions of ordinary Russians faced confusion, fear, and economic collapse. Factories shut down, prices exploded, savings that families had spent decades building became almost worthless. Jobs disappeared, pensions lost value, and many people struggled just to buy food. The dream of a better future quickly turned into a daily fight for survival. Russia's first president, Boris Yeltsin, promised to transform the country into a modern democracy with a free market economy. His government introduced rapid economic reforms, hoping they would create prosperity. But the transition was chaotic. Many state-owned companies were sold for incredibly low prices, allowing a small group of wealthy businessmen to gain control over Russia's most valuable industries. These men became known as the oligarchs. While a handful of people became incredibly rich, millions of ordinary citizens became poorer than ever before. Crime increased across the country. Corruption spread into almost every level of government. Public trust in politicians began to disappear. To many Russians, democracy no longer looked like freedom, it looked like disorder. As the economy struggled, another problem quietly grew in the background. Russia had once been one of the most powerful countries on Earth. It had competed directly with the United States, influenced global politics, and commanded enormous military strength. Now, many Russians felt their country had lost its international respect. For decades, they had been told they lived in a superpower. Suddenly, they found themselves watching other nations shape the future while Russia seemed weaker than ever. This emotional loss became just as important as the economic crisis. People didn't only miss stability, many also missed national pride. During this period, political debates became more intense. Some leaders argued that Russia needed more democratic reforms. Others claimed democracy itself had failed. These politicians promised something different: a stronger government, a stronger military, and a return to Russia's former greatness. Their message was simple: Russia has been humiliated. We must become powerful again. For citizens struggling with unemployment, inflation, and uncertainty, those promises became increasingly attractive. Meanwhile, another issue was making relations with the West more complicated. Several Eastern European countries began moving closer to NATO, the military alliance led by the United States and its allies. Western governments argued that every independent country had the right to choose its own security partnerships. But inside Russia, many politicians and military officials viewed NATO's expansion very differently. They believed the alliance was moving closer and closer to Russia's borders. Whether justified or not, this perception created growing distrust between Russia and the West. The optimism that had briefly existed after the Cold War slowly began to disappear. Instead of building a lasting partnership, suspicion replaced cooperation. Inside Russia, newspapers, television programs, and political speeches increasingly focused on one question: had Russia been treated fairly after the collapse of the Soviet Union? For some, the answer was yes. For many others, the answer was no. That feeling of disappointment gradually evolved into something much larger: a desire to restore Russia's influence and protect its place in the world. Few people realized it at the time, but these emotions would shape Russian politics for decades. The country stood at a crossroads. One path led towards stronger democratic institutions and closer cooperation with Europe. The other pointed towards centralized power, aggressive nationalism, and the dream of rebuilding Russia as a global superpower. History would soon reveal which direction Russia would choose. And in the shadows, a little-known former intelligence officer was quietly preparing for the opportunity that would change not only Russia, but the entire world. His name was Vladimir Putin. By the end of the 1990s, Russia was exhausted. The economy had been battered by years of instability. Corruption was widespread, public trust in politicians had collapsed, and many Russians longed for a leader who could restore order. Democracy had brought freedom for some, but for many ordinary citizens, it had also brought uncertainty and hardship. Amid this atmosphere, one man quietly emerged from the shadows. His name was Vladimir Putin. Unlike many well-known politicians of the time, Putin rarely attracted public attention. He had spent years serving in the Soviet intelligence agency, the KGB. After the Soviet Union dissolved, he continued his career in government and eventually became head of Russia's Federal Security Service, known as the FSB. To many Russians, he appeared disciplined, calm, and decisive. In 1999, President Boris Yeltsin made a surprising announcement. He resigned before the end of his term and named Putin as acting president. Just a few months later, Putin won the presidential election. For many citizens, he represented a fresh start. From his first days in office, Putin made one message clear: Russia would no longer accept weakness. He promised to rebuild the economy, strengthen the military, and restore the country's influence on the world stage. His speeches often emphasized stability, patriotism, and national unity. Many Russians welcomed this change. At the same time, the government began tightening its control over key institutions. Large television networks gradually came under greater state influence. Powerful businessmen who openly challenged the Kremlin lost political influence or left the country. Regional governors became more dependent on the central government in Moscow. Supporters argued these steps were necessary to restore order after years of chaos. Critics warned that Russia was becoming increasingly centralized and that democratic checks on power were weakening. While these changes unfolded at home, relations with the West continued to deteriorate. NATO admitted more countries from Eastern Europe, while Russia repeatedly expressed concern that the alliance was expanding closer to its borders. Western governments maintained that NATO was a defensive alliance and that each sovereign nation had the right to choose its own security arrangements. Russian leaders viewed the situation through a different lens. They argued that the balance of power established after the Cold War was shifting against Russia. These competing perspectives created growing mistrust on both sides. During this period, discussions about Russia's future also gained attention in academic and political circles. One of the most debated voices was political theorist Alexander Dugin. In 1997, he published a book titled Foundations of Geopolitics. The book argued that Russia should rebuild its global influence and challenge what it described as a world dominated by Western powers. Many analysts have debated how much influence Dugin's ideas had on actual government policy. Some believe his writings reflected broader nationalist thinking already present in Russia, rather than serving as an official blueprint for state decisions. Regardless of that debate, one idea was becoming increasingly popular among many Russian nationalists. Russia should once again become a major global power. As oil and gas prices increased during the 2000s, Russia's economy began to recover. Living standards improved for many families. With economic growth came growing confidence. For millions of Russians, Putin appeared to be delivering what previous governments could not: stability, stronger state institutions, and renewed national pride. Yet questions about political freedom remained. Independent media became less influential. Opposition parties faced increasing pressure. Civil society organizations operated under tighter restrictions. Supporters viewed these measures as necessary for national security. Opponents argued they reduced political competition and weakened democratic institutions. Russia was changing rapidly. The country that had experimented with democracy after the Soviet collapse was evolving into a political system centered increasingly around one leader. The foundations of modern Russia were being built, and beyond Russia's borders, another crisis was beginning to emerge, one that would eventually place Moscow and Kiev on a direct collision course. And we will explore how rising tensions with Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, and the events leading to the 2022 invasion reshaped global politics forever. From Crimea to the Ukraine War. By the early 2000s, Russia had regained much of the stability it had lost after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The economy had improved compared with the difficult years of the 1990s, the military was being modernized, and Vladimir Putin had become the dominant figure in Russian politics. But one issue continued to shape Moscow's foreign policy more than almost any other: Ukraine. For centuries, Russia and Ukraine had shared deep historical, cultural, and economic ties. Yet after the Soviet Union dissolved, Ukraine became an independent country and increasingly sought closer relations with Europe. This created a growing strategic disagreement. Many Ukrainians believed that stronger ties with Europe could bring economic opportunities and political reforms. Many Russian leaders, however, viewed Ukraine as a country that was deeply connected to Russia's history and security interests. These opposing visions would eventually collide. In late 2013, large demonstrations broke out in Ukraine after the government suspended plans to sign an agreement with the European Union. The protests grew rapidly. Months later, President Viktor Yanukovych left the country and a new government took power. Western governments largely describe these events as the result of a popular protest movement demanding political change. Russia argued that the change in government was supported by outside influence and threatened its security interests. These sharply different interpretations became a major turning point. In 2014, 2014, Russian forces took control of Crimea. Soon afterward, Russia formally incorporated the peninsula into the Russian Federation following a local referendum. Russia argued that the vote reflected the wishes of many Crimean residents. Ukraine, the United States, the European Union, and most members of the international community rejected the annexation as illegal under international law. The consequences were immediate. Western countries imposed economic sanctions on Russia. Relations between Moscow and Western capitals deteriorated sharply. Trust that had been weakening for years nearly disappeared. At the same time, fighting erupted in eastern Ukraine between Ukrainian forces and Russian-backed separatist groups, according to Ukraine and many Western governments. Russia acknowledged providing support to Russian-speaking populations, but disputed broader allegations about its military role during different stages of the conflict. For the next several years, the conflict remained unresolved. Ceasefire agreements reduced some fighting, but failed to produce a lasting peace. Meanwhile, political rhetoric on all sides became increasingly tense. Then came February 2022. Russia launched a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine. President Vladimir Putin stated that the operation was necessary to protect Russia's security and the people of the Donbas region, while also opposing Ukraine's closer ties with NATO. Ukraine rejected these claims, calling the invasion an unprovoked act of aggression against a sovereign nation. Most Western governments and the United Nations General Assembly condemned the invasion and reaffirmed Ukraine's territorial integrity. The war quickly became the largest armed conflict in Europe since World War II. Cities were heavily damaged. Millions of civilians fled their homes. Thousands of soldiers and civilians lost their lives, although the exact numbers remain disputed and continue to change. The conflict also transformed global politics. Energy prices surged. Food supplies were disrupted. Military spending increased across Europe. Countries reconsidered their security strategies, and international alliances became stronger in some regions while divisions deepened in others. Looking back, many historians argue that no single event explains how Russia and the West reached this point. It was not only about NATO. It was not only about Ukraine. It was not only about economics. Instead, decades of political decisions, historical grievances, competing security concerns, national identity, and mutual distrust gradually pushed both sides toward confrontation. Understanding this history does not require agreeing with every decision made by any government. Rather, it reminds us that major international conflicts rarely emerge overnight. They develop over many years through choices, missed opportunities, and growing suspicion. The story of modern Russia is therefore more than the story of one leader. It is the story of a nation searching for stability after the collapse of an empire, a changing international order, and a world still living with the consequences of those choices. The end.